The moment everything went sideways was when I walked into my garage and realized I wasn't alone. A woman I had never invited was standing just a few feet from my car, her phone held up, snapping photos like she was documenting a crime scene. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She just kept zooming in on my shelves, my tools, even the floor, quietly muttering about violations under her breath. I honestly thought I was being robbed. My heart started pounding as I asked her what she thought she was doing. She turned around slowly, looked straight at me without a hint of embarrassment and said, "I'm with the HOA. This won't take long." That was when my stomach dropped. This wasn't a clubhouse or a shared space. This was my private garage, attached to my home in Cedar Bluff Estates in Ridgeway Falls, Tennessee. And somehow, this woman, Marlene Whitaker, the HOA's self-appointed rule enforcer, thought she had the right to walk right in and treat it like public property. At the time, I had no idea those photos would be used against me or that her arrogance would end with me filing a police report that turned her little power trip into a serious legal problem. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When we first moved into Cedar Bluff Estates, life felt calm in a way I did not realize I would later miss so much. My wife, Emily, and I had been looking for a quiet place to raise our daughter, somewhere safe, green, and predictable. Cedar Bluff checked every box. The streets were lined with tall trees. Kids rode their bikes without parents hovering, and neighbors actually smiled and waved. The HOA paperwork was thick, sure, but it looked like standard stuff about lawn care, noise, and paint colors. Nothing screamed trouble, nothing felt threatening. At least not back then. For the first few years, the HOA was practically invisible. We paid our dues on time, kept the grass trimmed, and followed the basic rules without thinking twice. The board sent out the occasional newsletter about community events or reminders about trash pickup, but that was it. No drama, no threats, no power trips. It felt like the HOA existed in the background, quietly doing what it was supposed to do. Everything changed when Marlene Whitaker stepped into a position of authority. I still remember the first time I saw her walking the neighborhood with a clipboard tucked under her arm, stopping in front of houses and staring a little too long at driveways and lawns. She always had this tight smile on her face, the kind that looks friendly until you realize there is nothing warm behind it. She introduced herself as the head of the Architectural Compliance Committee, a title that immediately sounded more serious than it needed to be. The first notice I ever received from her was almost laughable. It said my trash cans had been visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. That was it. No greeting. No friendly reminder. Just a warning. I rolled my eyes, moved the cans sooner the next week, and forgot about it. At the time, I chalked it up to someone being overly enthusiastic about their new role. Then came another notice, and then another. Each one was small on its own, but together they started to feel personal. A warning about the angle of my driveway lights. A comment about the condition of my garage door. And then, finally, the letter that shifted everything into a different gear. According to Marlene, my garage was not being used properly. She claimed garages were intended for vehicle storage only and that anything else visible inside was considered non-compliant. Shelving units, tool cabinets, storage bins, all of it apparently violated community standards. I read the letter twice, genuinely confused. Nearly every garage on the street looked like mine, or worse. Bikes hanging from hooks. Freezers in the corner. Stacks of boxes. None of that had ever been an issue before. Still, I tried to handle it calmly. I sent her a polite email asking where, exactly, this rule was written. I did not argue. I did not accuse. I just asked for the section number or page reference so I could understand what I was supposed to fix. Her reply was short and dismissive. She did not cite a rule. She did not quote the bylaws. She simply said it was covered under community standards and that enforcement was at her discretion. That sentence bothered me more than the warning itself. Discretion. It sounded less like a rule and more like a personal opinion. From that point on, the tone shifted. Notices arrived faster. The language became sharper. What had started as minor reminders turned into threats of fines. It felt like Marlene was watching my house specifically, waiting for any excuse to write something down. Emily noticed it too. She started asking why the HOA was suddenly so interested in our garage when nothing had changed about how we used it. I did not have an answer for her. All I knew was that something about this situation felt off, and it was no longer just an annoyance. It was becoming stressful. Looking back now, that letter about the garage was the first real warning sign. It was the moment the HOA stopped feeling like a background organization and started feeling like an active presence in our lives. At the time, I still believed it could be resolved with a few emails and common sense. I had no idea that this was only the beginning. Over the next few months, the situation went from irritating to exhausting. The notices did not just continue, they multiplied. One week, it was a warning about shelves being visible when my garage door was open. The next week, it was a complaint about faint oil stains on the concrete, stains that had been there since before we even bought the house. Then came the most absurd one of all, an accusation that I was operating a workshop out of my garage. All because I had changed my own car oil one single time on a Saturday morning. Each notice felt less like enforcement and more like harassment. The language grew sharper, more accusatory, as if Marlene was building a case against me. Fines were mentioned more frequently. Deadlines became shorter. It was no longer framed as friendly compliance, but as punishment waiting to happen. I decided the best way to handle it was head-on. I requested time to speak at the next HOA board meeting. I went in calm, prepared, and respectful. I explained that I worked long hours, that my garage needed to be functional, and that everything inside it was neatly organized and safely stored. I even pointed out that many neighbors had similar setups. I did not get very far. Marlene cut me off mid-sentence, leaned back in her chair and said, "Rules are rules. No explanation, no discussion." Just that flat, dismissive line, delivered like it was the end of the conversation. I left that meeting with my jaw clenched and my patience running thin. What really started to bother me was how targeted it all felt. Once I started paying closer attention, I noticed plenty of garages that were far messier than mine. Doors left open for hours. Overflowing storage. Even full-on home gyms. None of them ever seemed to get notices. None of them got warnings taped to their doors or emails threatening fines. It became painfully clear that Marlene had singled me out. Emily noticed the change in me. I was more distracted, more tense. Every time the mail arrived, my stomach dropped. Every unfamiliar car slowing down near our house made me uneasy. Our home, the place that was supposed to feel safe, was starting to feel like it was under surveillance. Then came the afternoon that crossed a line I did not even know existed. I had come home early from work, planning to surprise Emily and take our daughter out for ice cream. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed my garage door was open. That was strange. I was certain I had closed it that morning. When I stepped inside, my heart jumped into my throat. Marlene was standing inside my garage. She was only a few feet from my car, phone raised, snapping pictures like she was cataloging evidence. Shelves. Tool cabinets. The floor. Nothing was off limits. For a split second, I honestly thought I had walked into a burglary. I asked her what she thought she was doing, my voice already rising. She didn't flinch. She calmly said the garage door had been partially open, and that gave her the right to inspect for violations. She said it like it was common sense, like everyone should already know that. I told her to leave, immediately. Instead of apologizing or backing off, she kept taking photos. When I stepped closer and raised my voice, she finally turned around, smirked slightly, and said, "If you don't have anything to hide, This shouldn't be a problem. That sentence lit something in me I had been trying very hard to keep under control. I told her again to get out of my garage. This time she did, brushing past me without another word, phone still in her hand. No apology, no acknowledgement that she had crossed into my private space. I stood there long after she left, shaking with anger and disbelief. That night, after our daughter was asleep, Emily and I sat at the kitchen table replaying everything. She listened quietly, her face growing more concerned with every detail. When I finished, she asked a question that stopped me cold. Was she even allowed to do that? I opened my mouth to answer, then realized I had no idea. Up until that moment, I had been so focused on complying, explaining, and keeping the peace that I never stopped to question whether the HOA actually had the authority to do what Marlene was doing. I had assumed they did. I had assumed this was just part of living in a neighborhood with rules. But standing in my own garage, watching a stranger photograph my belongings without permission did not feel right. It felt invasive. It felt wrong. That night, instead of relaxing, I sat at my computer long after Emily went to bed. I pulled up the HOA documents. I started reading. Slowly at first, then with growing urgency. I did not have the answer yet, but I was finally asking the right questions. That night turned into the first real turning point, even though I did not realize it right away. Instead of trying to calm myself down or convince myself to let it go, I started digging. I pulled every HOA document I could find onto the kitchen table. The bylaws, the declaration, the amendments. Pages and pages of dense language that I had barely skimmed when we first moved in. This time, I read every word slowly, line by line, with a highlighter in my hand. At first, it was frustrating. Legal language has a way of hiding meaning behind long sentences and vague terms. But the more I read, the clearer something became. The HOA's authority was not nearly as broad as Marlene had been acting like it was. Then I found the section that made my heart start pounding. The HOA had authority over common areas only. It had limited authority over exterior appearances, things like paint colors, fencing, and landscaping that could be seen from the street. But when it came to private residences, the language was crystal clear. The HOA had absolutely no authority to enter a home or any attached structure without written permission from the homeowner or a valid court order. I read that paragraph 3 times just to make sure I was not misunderstanding it. My garage was attached to my house. That meant it was part of my home, which meant Marlene had no right to step foot inside it, open door or not. As I kept reading, I noticed something else that had been ignored entirely. Any inspection, even of exterior issues, had to be scheduled in writing with at least 10 days' notice. The homeowner had to be informed of the reason for the inspection and given the opportunity to be present. None of that had happened. Not once. Every notice I had received came after the fact, often based on things Marlene claimed to have observed without warning. The more I pieced it together, the more my anger turned into something else. Clarity. For months, I had assumed I was in the wrong. I had bent over backward trying to comply, explain, and de-escalate. All the while, Marlene had been operating far outside the limits of her authority, counting on homeowners not knowing the rules well enough to challenge her. That realization changed everything. The next morning, I called a local attorney who specialized in property and HOA disputes. I half expected him to brush me off or tell me it was a gray area. Instead, he listened quietly as I explained everything, from the notices to the garage incident. When I finished, there was a brief pause on the line. Then he said, very calmly, "What you're describing sounds like trespassing." That single word hit harder than anything else he could have said. Trespassing. I repeated it out loud after we hung up, just to hear it. It felt strange applying that word to someone from the HOA. For so long, I had thought of them as an authority I had to obey. But suddenly, the situation looked completely different. Marlene had not been enforcing rules. She had been violating them. The attorney confirmed what I had already discovered. The HOA could not legally enter my garage. The photos she took could be considered unlawfully obtained, and if I chose to pursue it, I had every right to take action. For the first time since this all started, I felt something close to relief, not because the situation was over, but because I finally understood it. I was not just reacting anymore. I was no longer scrambling to keep up with demands that shifted every week. I had facts. I had documentation. I had leverage. And for the first time, Marlene and the HOA were not the only ones holding power. I was done being intimidated. Now, I was preparing to push back. With the attorney's guidance, I finally stopped playing defense. Instead of reacting to emails and warnings, I put everything in writing. A certified letter went out to the HOA board, not just Marlene. In it, I calmly but firmly cited the exact sections of the bylaws they had ignored. I quoted the language word for word. I explained that my garage was an attached structure and therefore part of my private residence. I demanded that every photo taken inside my garage be permanently deleted and removed from my HOA file. And I issued a formal notice stating that Marlene was not permitted on my property again without my written consent. Dropping that letter into the mailbox felt like crossing a line I could not uncross. But for the first time, it also felt empowering. I was no longer asking, I was asserting my rights. Their response came faster than I expected. Instead of acknowledging the violations or backing down even a little, the HOA doubled down. Within days, I received another letter, this one cold and threatening. They fined me $500 for non-cooperation and scheduled an HOA hearing without checking my availability. It was framed as mandatory, attendance required. Failure to comply would result in additional penalties. Attached to the notice was a familiar set of images. The photos Marlene had taken inside my garage, labeled as evidence. That was the exact moment it became clear that this was no longer about compliance or community standards. This was about ego. They were trying to intimidate me into submission, counting on the idea that I would panic, pay the fine, and fall back in line. Instead, I felt something snap into place. If they wanted to play this game, they were about to learn they had chosen the wrong person. I immediately called my attorney and forwarded him everything. He was not surprised. In fact, his reaction was almost calm to the point of boredom. He told me to keep every piece of correspondence, every envelope, every email header. Then he asked me one simple question. Are you ready to document this officially? That was when he suggested filing a police report. The idea felt extreme at first. Calling the police over an HOA issue sounded ridiculous in my head. But the more we talked through it, the clearer it became. This was not about rules anymore. Someone had entered my home without permission and documented my private property. That crossed a legal line, no matter who they claimed to represent. So I did it. I went to the local police station the next morning with a folder under my arm. Inside it were printed emails, the HOA letters, highlighted sections of the bylaws, and the photos Marlene had taken. I also brought timestamps from my security system showing when she entered and left, along with a statement from my neighbor who had seen her walk into my garage while I was not home. I expected skepticism. I expected an eye roll. That never came. The officer listened carefully as I explained everything from the beginning. He asked clarifying questions. He took notes. He reviewed the documents. When I pointed out the bylaw sections that explicitly prohibited entry into private residences, he nodded and made a copy. At no point did he laugh. At no point did he dismiss it as a civil matter and send me away. He told me that entering a private attached garage without permission could, in fact, qualify as trespassing, especially when photos were taken, especially when the homeowner had explicitly told the person to leave. Hearing that out loud made my chest tighten. For months, I had been made to feel like I was the problem, like I was unreasonable for questioning authority. Now, someone neutral was telling me that my instincts had been right all along. The officer filed the report and gave me a case number. He explained that it might take time, but the incident was now officially documented. That mattered. A lot. When I walked out of the station, the air felt different. Lighter, not because the situation was resolved, but because the balance had shifted. The HOA thought they were punishing me with fines and hearings. What they had actually done was create a paper trail of their own misconduct. Every aggressive letter, every ignored bylaw, every photo taken without permission was now part of an official record. They were no longer just dealing with a frustrated homeowner. They were dealing with consequences, and whether they realized it yet or not, they were digging a hole that was getting deeper by the day. The HOA hearing was scheduled for a weekday evening, and from the moment I walked into the clubhouse, I could feel the tension in the room. Folding chairs were lined up in uneven rows, and the board members sat at a long table up front, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. A handful of neighbors filled the seats behind me, whispering quietly. Word had spread that something serious was going on. Marlene sat near the front, stiff-backed and composed, a thick folder in front of her. She looked confident, almost smug, like she believed this was just another meeting where she would flex her authority and move on. The meeting started exactly how I expected. Marlene spoke first. She launched into a long explanation about community standards, resident cooperation, and how difficult it was to enforce rules when homeowners were hostile. Then she shifted the narrative entirely. She claimed that during the garage incident she felt intimidated and unsafe. She said my raised voice made her fear for her well-being. She painted herself as a volunteer just trying to do her job who had been unfairly confronted. I sat there, jaw tight, listening to a version of events that barely resembled reality. Then it was my attorney's turn. He stood up calmly, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a steady, measured tone. There was no emotion in his voice, no theatrics. He explained that this was not a dispute about organization or aesthetics. It was about authority and boundaries. He walked the board through the exact sections of the governing documents that limited the HOA's power to common areas and exterior appearances. Then he introduced the police report. The room changed immediately. You could feel it, like the air had been sucked out. Board members stopped flipping through papers. A few neighbors leaned forward in their chairs. My attorney explained that the report documented an unpermitted entry into a private attached garage and the taking of photographs without consent. He made it clear that the photos being used as evidence were unlawfully obtained. That was when the room went completely quiet. One of the board members, a man who had been silent up until that point, cleared his throat and looked directly at Marlene. "Did you have written permission to enter the garage?" he asked. Marlene hesitated, just for a moment. Then she said no. Another board member spoke up, her voice tight. "Were you aware that the garage is considered part of the residence under our governing documents?" Marlene shifted in her seat. "I assumed it wasn't," she said. That single word landed hard. Assumed. My attorney did not interrupt. He let it hang there, heavy and undeniable. Then he calmly explained that assumptions do not override written rules, and they certainly do not excuse entering a private residence. The board members exchanged glances. The confidence Marlene had walked in with was gone. She started flipping through her folder, searching for something that was not there. There was no policy that supported her actions, no clause that gave her the authority she claimed. One of the neighbors in the back let out a quiet sigh, like they had been holding their breath the entire time. The board chair finally spoke, his voice noticeably more cautious than it had been at the start of the meeting. He said they needed time to review the information presented, including the police report and the alleged violations of procedure. he announced that all enforcement actions related to my garage were temporarily suspended pending further review. Marlene's face tightened. The hearing ended without a decision, but the shift was unmistakable. What had started as an attempt to discipline me had turned into a serious problem for the HOA itself. The board members avoided Marlene as they packed up their papers. She left the room quickly, not making eye contact with anyone. As my attorney and I walked out, he leaned slightly toward me and said, "That assumption is going to cost her." And for the first time since this all began, I believed that the outcome was no longer uncertain. The power dynamic had changed. Marlene no longer controlled the room. Now, she was the one under scrutiny. 2 weeks after that hearing, the fallout finally arrived. It did not come with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It came quietly, officially, and in writing. Marlene Whitaker was served with a formal trespass warning. The notice made it clear that she was not permitted to enter my property again for any reason. Any future attempt to do so would result in immediate legal consequences. When my attorney showed me a copy, I felt a mix of relief and disbelief. For months, she had acted like she owned the neighborhood. Now, the law had drawn a hard line she could not cross. Behind the scenes, the HOA's attorney had stepped in and taken control of the situation. From what I later learned, he advised the board to settle immediately. The police report, the bylaw violations, and the illegally obtained photos had created a liability the HOA could not afford to ignore. The next letter I received was very different from the ones before. Every fine related to my garage was reversed. The balance on my account was cleared. The photos were formally removed from my file, and the HOA provided written confirmation that they had been deleted. There was even something I never expected to see: a written apology. It was brief and carefully worded, but it was there. An acknowledgement that procedures had not been followed and that my rights as a homeowner had been violated. Marlene's name was noticeably absent from the signature line. Shortly after, the board announced that she had been removed from the Architectural Compliance Committee effective immediately. No explanation was given, but the message was clear. She was no longer in charge of enforcement. I thought that might be the end of it. I was wrong. At the next community meeting, the room was packed in a way I had never seen before. Neighbors filled every chair, lined the walls, and stood near the doors. There was a low buzz of conversation, an undercurrent of tension that had been building for a long time. When the board opened the floor for discussion, something unexpected happened. People started standing up. One by one, neighbors shared their experiences, mournings over trivial issues, threats of fines without citations, unannounced inspections, intimidating emails. Stories poured out, and with each one it became clearer that I was not an isolated case. Marlene's behavior had affected far more people than I ever realized. Some of them had paid fines just to make it stop. Others had altered their homes out of fear. A few admitted they had wanted to speak up but did not think anyone would listen. The board sat in stunned silence as the pattern revealed itself. Then the motion was made. A vote to remove Marlene Whitaker from the HOA board entirely. The ballots were distributed, collected, and counted right there in the room. The result was not even close. By overwhelming majority, Marlene was removed from the board. She did not speak. She did not argue. She stood up, gathered her things, and walked out without looking back. There was no applause, no cheering, just a quiet sense of release. Justice did not come with fireworks or revenge. It came clean. It came through paperwork, procedures, and people finally refusing to stay silent. As the meeting ended and neighbors began to file out, several of them stopped to thank me. Not for starting a fight, but for finishing one, for pushing back when it mattered. Walking home that night, I realized something important. The power Marlene had relied on was never real. It only existed because people were afraid to question it. Once that fear was gone, everything changed. After everything settled, life in Cedar Bluff Estates began to feel normal again, slowly and almost cautiously at first. It was not an overnight change. There was no sudden celebration or announcement that everything was fixed. Instead, there was a quiet shift in tone, the kind you feel more than you see. The HOA sent out a community-wide notice explaining that inspection policies had been revised. From that point forward, all inspections had to be scheduled in writing, with proper notice, and homeowners had the right to be present. No more surprise walk-ups. No more vague enforcement. No more intimidation dressed up as community standards. That single notice did more to calm the neighborhood than any meeting ever had. For the first time in months, I stopped bracing myself every time I checked the mail. Emails from the HOA returned to being boring and informational. Reminders about trash pickup. Notices about landscaping schedules. The kind of stuff you skim and forget 5 minutes later. The anxiety that had been hanging over our household finally started to lift. My garage stayed exactly the way I needed it to be. Shelves where they belonged, tools organized. Storage bins stacked neatly, nothing hidden. Nothing changed, and that mattered more to me than I expected. It was not about the shelves or the tools. It was about knowing that the space was mine again. No one was watching. No one was judging. No one was looking for reasons to punish me for living my life. Emily noticed the difference in me almost immediately. I was sleeping better. I was less irritable. We spent more evenings outside with our daughter, riding bikes and talking to neighbors instead of retreating indoors. The house felt lighter, like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The neighborhood itself changed too. People started talking again. Real conversations, not whispered complaints. Neighbors who had barely nodded before now stopped to chat at the mailbox. There was a sense that something unspoken had been resolved, that a line had been drawn and respected. The HOA board members were more visible, but in a different way. They listened more. They asked questions. They explained decisions instead of issuing demands. Accountability had a way of doing that. As for Marlene, she faded out of the picture faster than I expected. Less than a year after everything happened, her house went up for sale. There was no announcement, no explanation. One day, the driveway was empty, and the next, a moving truck came and went. I heard through a neighbor that she had relocated out of state. I do not know where she went, and I truly do not care. What mattered was not her departure, but what she left behind. The neighborhood she once controlled through fear no longer operated that way. Her absence was not a victory lap. It was simply confirmation that her approach had never belonged there in the first place. Looking back, I realized that the real resolution was not the reversed fines or the apology letter. It was the restoration of boundaries. The understanding that an HOA exists to serve a community, not dominate it. That rules mean nothing without accountability, and authority means nothing without limits. Cedar Bluff Estates felt like a neighborhood again, not a checklist. Kids played in driveways without parents worrying about complaints. Garage doors stayed open on weekends. People worked on projects, cleaned out storage, and lived in their homes without constantly wondering who might be watching. That sense of normalcy, so simple and so easily taken for granted, was finally back. If there was one thing this experience taught me, it was that silence is what allows overreach to grow. Most people are not looking for conflict. They just want peace. But sometimes, protecting that peace means speaking up, even when it is uncomfortable. I did not set out to change the HOA or expose anyone. I just wanted my home to be respected. In the end, that was enough. Boundaries were restored, and the community was stronger because of it. When I look back on everything that happened, the hardest part was never the fines, the letters, or the meetings. It was the feeling that my home was no longer mine. That at any moment someone could step into my space, judge it, photograph it, and use it against me without my consent. That feeling sticks with you in a way paperwork never does. Standing up for myself was not easy. It was stressful. It was uncomfortable. There were moments when I wondered if it would have been simpler to just give in and let it go. But the truth is, once you let someone cross one boundary, they rarely stop on their own. Silence does not bring peace. It just invites more overreach. What this experience taught me is that authority only works when it has limits. An HOA is not a landlord. It is not law enforcement. And it certainly is not allowed to ignore its own rules just because no one challenges it. Sometimes, the person who wins is not the loudest or the most aggressive. Sometimes, it is the quiet homeowner who reads the fine print, keeps records, and refuses to be intimidated. I did not set out to make an example of anyone. I just wanted my home respected. In the end, that was enough to restore balance, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. If this story proves anything, it is that you do not have to accept unfair treatment just because it comes with official letterhead. You have rights, and those rights matter. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?